The night began like any other. Tabatha settled into bed. She felt the warmth of her blankets. Sleep came easily. Then it happened, a sudden jolt, a feeling of being pulled back from the brink. Tabatha's eyes snapped open. She was awake, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. A heavy, invisible weight pressed down on her chest. Panic swelled inside her, a terrifying wave threatening to drown her. Her mind raced. This was no ordinary nightmare. This was sleep paralysis. Trapped within her own body, Tabatha's fear escalated. The room, once familiar and comforting, now appeared distorted. Shadows danced at the periphery of her vision, whispering secrets she couldn't understand. A low growl rumbled from the darkness. It seemed to vibrate in her bones. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing there, except for Tabatha and the suffocating presence that held her captive. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone. It was then that Tabatha felt it, a presence. Something dark and malevolent had entered the room. The air grew heavy, the temperature plummeted. She was no longer alone. Slowly, she turned her head towards the foot of her bed, her eyes strained against the darkness. And then she saw it, a shape, vaguely humanoid, but twisted and wrong. The figure shifted in the dim light, its edges solidifying into a grotesque parody of a human form. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and thin, like those of a spider. They twitched and contorted with an unnatural fluidity. As it stepped closer, each movement was agonizingly slow, deliberate, as if it savored her terror. The faint light from the hallway glinted off its skin, revealing a sickly pale hue. Terror, raw and primal, surged through her veins, but the paralysis held her fast. A cruel jailer in the face of unimaginable horror. The creature leaned closer, its head tilting at an unnatural angle as if it were studying her. It was then that Tabatha got a clear look at its face. It was a horrifying mask of stretched, glistening skin, devoid of any features save for two gaping black pits where its eyes should have been. They burned with an unholy light, reflecting nothing back at her. A low, guttural growl emanated from the creature, vibrating through the air. Her breath hitched in her throat, her chest constricting with terror. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. The creature took another step closer, its form seeming to waver and distort at the edges. Its long, spidery fingers twitched, and Tabatha could have sworn she saw a long black tongue slither across its lipless mouth. A wave of nausea washed over her, the stench of decay filling her nostrils. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of terror. This was not a dream. This thing was in her room, and it was getting closer. The creature leaned in, its head hovering inches from her face. Its breath, hot and fetid, washed over her, carrying with it the stench of decay. Its eyes, those black pits of nothingness, seemed to bore into her very soul. A scream welled up inside her, but it died in her throat. She was utterly helpless, a prisoner in her own body, and then a cold, clammy hand touched her cheek. The creature's touch seemed to jolt something within Tabatha, a spark of defiance, a primal urge to survive, ignited in the face of unimaginable terror. The icy grip on her muscles loosened, just a fraction, but enough to give her hope. She could feel her fingers twitching, the barest hint of movement returning to her leaden limbs. Her breath, shallow and ragged, caught in her throat. With a surge of adrenaline, she threw all her will into breaking free from the paralysis. She thrashed against the invisible bonds, her body jerking erratically. And then, as suddenly as it had descended, the paralysis lifted. Tabatha gasped, sucking in huge gulps of air. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Sweat slicked her skin, cold and clammy against the sheets. For a moment the creature seemed startled, its grotesque head jerking back. The creature retreated back into the shadows, melting into the darkness. Tabatha scrambled out of bed, her legs shaky beneath her. She stumbled back, her hand finding the wall for support, her eyes frantically searching the room, but it was gone. The only evidence of its presence was the lingering stench of decay. She stood there for a long moment, her breath catching in her throat. The silence of the room pressed in on her, heavy and oppressive. It had been real. The creature, the touch, the terror. It had all been too vivid to be anything but real. Morning came, painting the room in hues of normalcy, yet the terror of the night lingered. The sun offered no solace, its rays unable to penetrate the shadows that had seeped into her soul. The events of the night replayed in her mind, each horrifying detail etched into her memory. She had convinced herself it had been a bad dream, but the lingering scent of decay clung to the air. Sleep, once a source of comfort, now filled her with dread. Yet exhaustion eventually pulled her under, and she found herself once again at the mercy of the night. The paralysis came upon her like a thief in the night, stealing her breath, her voice, her very ability to move. The familiar pressure on her chest sent a wave of terror crashing over her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The creature was there, waiting for her, as if it had never left. It stood at the foot of her bed, its form more solid now, less spectral. Its eyes, those black pits of nothingness, burned with an eerie intensity, and then it moved. With a swiftness that belied its ungainly form, the creature glided across the room. It circled her bed, a predator toying with its prey. The stench of decay, stronger this time, filled her nostrils. Terror, raw and primal, coiled in the pit of her stomach. She thrashed against the invisible bonds that held her captive. The creature seemed to savor her fear, its grotesque head tilting to the side as if studying her. It was growing bolder, its presence more insistent. Night after night, the terror repeated. Sometimes the creature remained at a distance, a menacing shadow lurking at the periphery of her vision. Other times it drew closer, its touch a violation, its breath hot and fetid on her skin. The frequency of the episodes increased, the lines between nightmare and reality blurring. Her world had shrunk to the confines of her bedroom, a prison built of her own terror. Sleep had become her tormentor, a nightly descent into a personal hell. And as the nights wore on, a terrifying thought began to take root. The creature was after her sanity. Desperation clawed at Tabatha, a living thing as tangible as the creature that haunted her nights. She couldn't live like this, imprisoned by her own terror. The once vibrant colors of her world had faded to muted grays. She sought answers in the sterile confines of a doctor's office. The words felt inadequate, hollow, failing to convey the visceral terror that gripped her. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, listened patiently. Tabatha clung to the hope that science could explain away the horror. The results, when they came, offered no such comfort. Her blood work was normal, her brain scans unremarkable. The doctor, her brow furrowed as she reviewed the findings, offered a diagnosis as sterile and impersonal as the examination table on which Tabatha sat. Sleep paralysis, a common, if often terrifying, sleep disorder. Nothing to be overly concerned about. She was prescribed medication, a small bottle of pills meant to ward off the unwelcome visitor from her dreams. The doctor spoke of stress management, of sleep hygiene, of rationalizing away the fear. Her words, though well-intentioned, rang hollow in Tabatha's ears, a discordant melody against the symphony of terror that played on in her mind. The pills, taken religiously, offered no respite. The creature, undeterred by her attempts to medicate away its presence, continued its nightly torment, its grip on her psyche tightening with each terrifying encounter. The doctor, her expression a mixture of concern and helplessness, had no other answers, no other solutions to offer. Tabatha left the sterile confines of the medical world as she had entered it, alone, terrified, and no closer to understanding the nightmare that had taken root in her life. Desperate for solace, for any explanation that could offer a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness, Tabatha turned to the solace of faith. She sought refuge in the hushed sanctity of an old church, its stained glass windows casting kaleidoscopes of color onto the worn kneelers below. The scent of incense, heavy and sweet, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the cloying stench of decay that clung to the creature in her nightmares. She poured her heart out to the priest, a kind-eyed man with a gentle demeanor, his words a soothing balm on her raw nerves. He listened patiently as she recounted the horrors that plagued her nights, his gaze unwavering, his silence a comfort in the face of her terror. He spoke of evil spirits, of demons that preyed on the vulnerable, of the power of faith to banish darkness. He offered prayers, blessings, and a small silver crucifix, its cool touch a stark contrast to the icy grip of the creature that haunted her dreams. But as the days turned into nights and the creature continued its relentless torment, Tabatha felt her faith wavering. The prayers offered no solace, the blessings no protection. The crucifix, though clutched tightly in her hand, felt cold and lifeless against the very real terror that tightened its grip on her soul. The realization dawned slowly, a chilling certainty that settled over her like a shroud. The doctors had no answers, their science unable to penetrate the realm of nightmares that had become her reality. The church, a beacon of hope in a world gone dark, offered little more than platitudes and prayers, a flimsy shield against the very real terror that stalked her nights. She was alone. The thought, once a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, now roared in her ears, a deafening chorus of despair. The rational part of her mind, the part that clung to logic and reason, told her she was being irrational, that her fear was feeding the nightmare, giving it substance where there was none. But deep down, in the primal recesses of her being, where fear and instinct intertwined, a terrifying truth took root. This was not a figment of her imagination, not a trick of a sleep-deprived mind. This was real, and it was a part of her now, inextricably linked to her very being. And as the nights wore on, and the creature's visits became more frequent, more intimate, more terrifying, a chilling question began to form in Tabatha's mind. Was it truly her sanity that the creature was after? Isolation became Tabatha's new reality, a prison built not of bars and concrete, but of fear and despair. The outside world, once a source of comfort and distraction, now seemed distant, irrelevant, a faded tapestry hanging just beyond her reach. She withdrew into the confines of her home, her sanctuary transformed into a cage of her own making. Days bled into nights, each one indistinguishable from the last, a monotonous cycle of dread and exhaustion. Sleep, once a source of respite, now loomed over her like a threat, a descent into a terrifying abyss where the creature awaited, its presence a suffocating weight on her chest. She tried to distract herself, to fill the empty hours with activities that once brought her joy. Books lay open on tables, their pages filled with words that no longer held meaning. Half-finished projects sat abandoned, testaments to her inability to focus, to find solace in anything but the crushing weight of her own fear. But the creature was always there, lurking at the edges of her awareness, a constant shadow in the corner of her eye, a whisper in the silence of her own mind. It was a presence she couldn't escape, a chilling reminder that she was no longer in control, that something else, something dark and insidious, had taken root in the fertile ground of her fear. The whispers began subtly, a faint murmur at the edge of her hearing, easily dismissed as the creaking of an old house settling, or the wind rustling through the trees outside her window. But as the days turned into weeks and the creature's hold on her psyche tightened, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, more insidious. They spoke of things she couldn't quite grasp, fragments of sentences that slithered into her thoughts, like venomous snakes planting seeds of doubt and despair. They whispered of her deepest fears, her darkest secrets, the things she kept buried deep within, hidden even from herself. They told her she was going mad, that her fear was consuming her, turning her into something monstrous, something other. And slowly, insidiously, Tabatha began to believe them. The line between her own thoughts and the whispers from the darkness blurred until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Her mind, once a sanctuary of logic and reason, had become a battleground, a place where her sanity was under constant assault by an unseen enemy. One night, as she lay in bed, her body rigid with terror, the creature hovering over her, its grotesque features illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the window, a terrifying realization dawned. It wasn't just her sanity that the creature was after. It was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with each passing moment of terror, each whimper of despair. She saw it then, with a clarity that sent chills down her spine. The creature wasn't separate from her, not some external entity that tormented her from the shadows. It was a part of her, a manifestation of her own deepest fears, given form and substance by her terror. The more she feared it, the stronger it became. The more she struggled against it, the tighter its grip on her psyche became. It was a vicious cycle, a downward spiral into madness, and she was caught in its relentless grasp. The realization, terrifying as it was, brought with it a flicker of hope, a sliver of understanding in the encroaching darkness. If the creature was born of her fear, then perhaps she could control it, could starve it by confronting the darkness within herself. But could she find the strength to face her own demons, to confront the terror that threatened to consume her? The line between reality and nightmare had vanished, leaving Tabatha stranded in a desolate landscape of terror. The creature, once a visitor from the depths of her sleep paralysis, was now an unwelcome resident in her mind, its presence a constant weight on her soul. She could feel it there, coiled within her, feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every panicked heartbeat, every stifled scream. It was no longer a matter of escaping the creature. It was a fight for survival against the darkness that bloomed within her. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, a chilling truth that settled in her gut like a stone. Her own terror, once a fleeting visitor, had become her jailer, and the creature was the embodiment of her worst nightmares. Each night the creature grew bolder, its presence more insidious. It whispered to her in the quiet moments, its voice a chilling echo of her own doubts and fears, amplifying them, twisting them, until she could no longer distinguish her own thoughts from the creature's venomous whispers. It was a slow, agonizing consumption, a relentless erosion of her sense of self, her grip on reality slipping further with each passing moment. And as Tabatha stared into the abyss of her own terror, a horrifying question echoed in the silence of her mind. Was she slowly becoming the very nightmare that haunted her? Or had the creature already claimed her, consumed her from within, leaving behind only a hollow shell, a puppet dancing to the tune of its own fear?